And so if we hope that that's okay with everybody, but if anyone has an objection to it, please do write into us and we'll figure this out. One important note is for all the participants in the discussion to keep their audio and video off, to keep it on mute. And also, we also request the panelists to keep it off unless they're speaking. They can keep the video on if they want. We also, after this session goes on from 10:30 to 11:30 when there's a discussion moderated by Avehi. Avehi will ask questions of the panelists. Then we take a 15-minute break, following which there is an open interactive session on focusing specifically on oral histories as archival objects, which again will be moderated by Avehi. And we are hoping that Nandini Oza will also join that discussion. If you have any questions, you can leave it in the chat box, and we'll try and put all of those together and take them at the end of the session. If you have any technical issues, I request you to message me directly. Don't put it on the chat box for everyone to see. You can message me privately. My name is Hari on the Zoom window. One request is the chat is open for everyone, and we request that you keep your chats short and polite. If you want to ask a question at the end of the session, there is an option where you can raise your hand. You'll see that next to your name in the participant list. So you can raise your hand and we'll know you want to ask a question. And once your question has been answered, we request you to put down your hand, drop your hand. I think that's about it. And also, in case the panelist is sharing the screen, the default option often tends to be that the whole screen is taken up by the screen share. But if you look at the top of your screen, there are options where you can make the size of the screen share smaller so you can see other features also, right? So if you have any issues, feel free to message me privately in the chat box. And now I'll hand over to Avehi to introduce herself and the panelists. Avehi, over to you. Avehi, I can't hear you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So we had to start with me being kind of unmuted, and I think that's a characteristic of this platform. But hello everyone, and welcome to today's session, Forms of the Archival Object. I'm Avehi Menon, and I'm the Archive Director at Sarmaya Arts Foundation, which is a virtual museum with a physical archive in Mumbai. I'm also an oral historian, and so travel between these sectors and spaces. We have 4 amazing panelists who I'm going to give short introductions to, and then we're going to jump into conversation. This is meant to be an informal conversation, informal dialogue between us, and we'll probably speak or have a conversation for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then take questions at the end. So just to introduce the panelists, Indira Chowdhury. Dr. Indira Chowdhury is trained as a historian. She was professor at Jadavpur University before she became an archivist at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. She has set up several institutional and corporate archives and is the founder director of the Center for Public History at the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore. Jaya Ravindran is assistant director of archives at National Archives of India, with nearly 3 decades of experience among public records. She's a postgraduate in modern Indian history from Delhi University. And she says, though not a trained archivist, her passion for archives and reading has really helped her grow as an archivist and in the profession. Kamini Sahwney is Director, Museum of Art and Photography, Bangalore. MAP is an upcoming museum that will open doors later this year or early next year. It has a growing collection that includes over 18,000 works of art, predominantly from the subcontinent. Previously, Kamini led the Jahangir Nicholson Art Foundation, which is now functions as the modern and contemporary art wing of the CSMVS in Mumbai. Roland Wittje is Associate Professor of the History of Science and Technology at the Indian Institute of Science, IIT Madras. His research interests include history of the physical sciences and engineering in the 19th and 20th century, scientific instruments, university collections, scientific practice, and scientific and technical education. He currently works on an Indo-German collaboration in setting up IIT Madras between 59 and 74, and is in charge of setting up the IIT Madras archives. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm quite excited about this panel because our panelists come from such different perspectives, talking about various forms of the archival object, from oral histories to museum objects, to records, documents, and scientific equipment. And I think archives are really powerful tools that shape memory and history. And I think having such a diverse panel only demonstrates that while the need to archive for memory, record, posterity against erasure remains the same, the archival object and its forms have really expanded. So to begin with, this is a question for all the panelists, and maybe we can go in the order of Indira, Jaya, Kamini, and then Roland. If you could tell us a little more about the archival forms that you engage with, and also address the transformation that takes place when an object arrives at the archive. Indira, if we can begin with you. Indira? Okay, till we figure out, Indira, can you hear me? Okay, Jaya, do you want to answer the question about what are the archival forms that you engage with, and the sort of transformation of an object when it arrives at the archive?
Okay, I think I'll take that question.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I think I'm the only person who is representing the public records per se, the biggest one in South Asia, you can say. We have, before I start, I'd just like to give a brief about National Archives of India. It was set up in 1891 in erstwhile capital of British India in Calcutta, to be precise. Since 1891, we have been adding on to the public records. And in fact, the record series start from the middle of 18th century. We have over 42-kilometer shelf space of public records. Now, post-independence period, of course, it started changing. We started getting in private records also. So now it's not just public records. We have private papers. We have a section exclusively for Oriental records. And but what we miss out in National Archives of India are audiovisual archives. We don't have a separate audiovisual archives, but there are visuals among the public records. Now coming to your question, what do we do? There is a certain set of protocols lined up for all these records which come to us. I think Ms. Indira has come in. Should I stop or?
No, please continue. I think Indira can go after you.
Okay. So the first question is what kind of records we get, since we are, as I told you, we are public records, not everything comes to us. There are certain kind of records which are deemed to come to National Archives of India because they have been, there's something called a record retention schedule. This is a new terminology post-independence period, but in pre-independence period also, they had a policy of weeding out ephemeral kind of records. So the records which were thought to be of importance to the administrators, obviously these are administrator records, so only those records can come to us. Even now, there are certain standards, we have A, B, and C category records, or the categorizations are there. What all kinds of records go into each category, that is clearly defined. It is there for each and every government department. And according to that, at the end of 25 years, we have a final review or an appraisal, you can say, and that's when it's a joint exercise between the National Archives of India and the creating ministry or department. And then those records come to us. Only, say around, you can say around 40% of the records, the physical records come to us out of the total number of records that are generated. Now, once the records come to us, since these are government records and paper records, we have to follow certain protocols. These are records which are coming from outside the National Archives of India. The first thing we do is we send it for air cleaning and fumigation. That is the first step. Before that, we don't let it enter anywhere inside the archives. From there, it goes through something like what we call as the accession procedures. They are physically verified. So these records are transferred to us along with something called a transfer list. But we have to verify whether all the records that are being sent, they are as per the transfer list. The physical verification takes place. And sometimes what we realize is the numbers which are mentioned in the list, the transfer list is not actually there. And sometimes the files which are there are not mentioned there. So we have to do all that thing, add or delete, and then one final list is handed over to the concerned creating ministry. And one is sent to the research room where the records would be ultimately consulted by the researchers or the users. And one list along with the records go to the concerned repository. You see, our repository is so huge. I told you it's over 42-kilometer shell space. So you can imagine, both the buildings have repositories. And we know where, we know which record series are in which place. Another thing I want to tell you, since these are records, government records coming from the ministry, it's not necessary that chronologically all the records of a particular year are transferred to us at the end of 25 years. It doesn't happen that way. Sometimes we get records of 1950s even now. So we have to ensure that these records are also amalgamated with what had come to us earlier. We have to ensure that the system of provenance is maintained, because these are legally important. In a court of law, we have to prove that we have been following the system of provenance, and there's not been any break in that. That is very important. Now, as far as these are public records. For private papers also, as I told you, we are getting private papers. Private papers, of course, our thrust is more on getting records as donations or gifts. Very rarely we may purchase them also. For purchase, every year National Archives of India comes out with something like we have a committee, Historical Documents Purchase Committee. Advertisements are brought out in newspapers where we ask people to let us know if they have any old records which are of importance to the nation, which talk about the history or the culture of our nation. And, these people can approach us. And some of them, of course, may seek some monetary benefit. But of course, that is evaluated, the provenance, the age, and all that is evaluated by the committee concerned. And then it is decided whether how much money is to be paid in. But again, the process is the same, the accession and everything, and only after that are they made available for researchers. This is the procedure.
Okay.
And one more thing, we, unlike the museums, most of our records are paper records. That is where I think we are quite different from the other panelists. I think most of you are dealing with artifacts and all. We do have certain artifacts, but not regular.
Thank you. I think that, so just talking about materiality, it's a good shift to Indira, and Indira, if you can tell us address the same question of the archival forms you've engaged with, and the sort of authoritative transformation of an object when it arrives at the archive. We can't hear Indira. Unfortunately.
Can somebody help her by testing her mic?
Indira, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. So can I just go to Kamini next and then? Okay, Kamini, sorry, can I bring you in to address the same question till we figure out the issues with Indira's audio?
Sure, okay. So because I'm from a museum background, I'd kind of like to set the context here.
Yeah.
Because museums are institutions that have evolved over time. I mean, they began as a cabinet of curiosities in Renaissance Europe, because trade began to grow between the countries, and people, especially wealthy patrons, began to collect all these sorts of strange, wonderful objects that they encountered in different countries. So that was a cabinet of curiosities, and it has been replaced in the 19th century with the official institutions and the private collections, until we have the museum of today, which is much more interactive and engaging rather than those formal institutions which just set out objects. But since we have so many people in the archives and we're discussing archives today, the museum's role is really twofold. One, of course, is to be an archive, which documents, restores, and preserves objects. But I think an equally important role of the museum, if not more important, is to exhibit these objects, to educate and communicate the relevance of these objects to visitors. Because the point of a museum is to share its collection with visitors. So no visitors, what's the point of the museum at all? So in today's world, I feel the museum really has to reinvent itself to stay relevant, because it cannot be just a repository of objects. So we see MAP as a space for ideas and conversations that we initiate through the collection. So the archive becomes the tool to initiate these conversations.
Right.
So when an object comes into the archive, our primary role, besides seeing that it is preserved and documented, would really be to unlock the story that that object tells. Because museums are really, I see them as the custodians of the story of mankind. So, I mean, people today say, why will I go into a museum? It's full of dead objects. But no, that's our role, to bring that object to life. Because that object really tells you about yourself. It tells you where you came from, why you live the way you do, why do you follow certain customs and lifestyles. It also can give you clues about your future. So I think the importance is to be able to communicate the story of every object that comes into your museum.
Right, thank you. Roland, if I can bring you in to talk about your experience.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fine. So I think we have already come in with like having the National Archives and having the museums. I think, I mean, there is an important question that we have to raise, and that is, what is an archive? What is a collection, and what is a museum? And we also have different kind of roles, even though obviously today a lot of people would argue that the kind of boundary between what is a museum and what is an archive is kind of breaking down. Even though historically we see I mean, we've heard a little bit about the history of archives and the history of museums, and the history is actually quite different. But really to see, okay, there is, even though we have a lot of kind of mixtures. I mean, I've been vice president of a European Association for University Heritage, right? And what we see is that there's a lot of institutions that, for example, have what they can say mixed collections. So they have archive collections and they have objects, right? But we can say, and we can also say that every good museum, I mean, if you have a larger museum, you also have an archive. You have a very separate archive, which both keeps the information of how the object, actually the provenance of the object, right? Like how the object was actually acquired into the collection, but it also keeps all the documentation about the object, right? So if you go to all the bigger museums, you will see that the museum by itself houses an archive, which is organized more like other traditional archives. But obviously there's also a lot of different kind of collections that keep both, I mean, if you think, for example, I don't know, like seed banks or like genetic information, right? Like, which we have that, we can ask, is that like from the modern life sciences, is that an archive or is that a museum collection, right? And you will see it's kind of somewhere in between. So I have been working myself both in an archive. I started, my first experience with archives was actually, apart from being an historian and being a user of the archive, I actually worked for the Norwegian State Archive, which is kind of similar, different country, but like the Norwegian National and State Archives. But then I've been more in the collection and the museum world, and then now coming to IIT Madras, thinking about these issues, but seeing the need before we actually establish or we look out for objects and we create collections of objects, that what we actually need is more of a conventional archive, like a conventional, even administrative archive, because if we really want to understand the objects, even if you go out and look for the objects at IIT Madras, at a university, we need this kind of archival information to find out about the provenance and the metadata of the objects, right? Like when were they bought, right? Specifically if there were more expensive objects, how much did they cost, and all these kind of things. So acquisition or accession, whether you're in an archive or in a museum, is a very, very tricky thing. And also it cannot really be automated, right? I mean, even though we heard there is a lot of procedures, but it very much depends on the knowledge of the curator or of the archivist. You have to know something about the history of the institution or the people that you're collecting from, right? And then you have a relationship with the donor, which is very, very important. Also, I have to point out, whether you're in the archive or in the museum world, the first decision you take actually whether you take a thing or you don't. And most of the things we don't take, right? Like if you're in the museum world, it's very clear, right? Like we don't take trash, right? We don't go around and keep up people's trash, even though as an archaeologist, you would say there's so much historical information in trash, right? Like, but obviously we do not convert our world into a museum, for example, right? So there's a lot of things, also a lot of written objects, right? Like which will never go to the archive. So the first decision we are taking, and that's a very powerful decision for history, is that we throw. Like if you come from information theory, you will say information processing is information destruction, right? You destroy a lot of objects. And then we also have to understand that we are actually not the first curators of the objects or of the documents, because somebody has collected them before. Whether that was an office clerk or that was a private person is a different story, but people have kept both documents and objects for certain purposes, right? Like there might be, because I think they're important historical records, there might be other reasons, right? And I've even been writing about this, or we've been working on this. Why do things actually, why people do collect things, right? Like, and then eventually they end up in museums or in archives, right? And then obviously the objects or the documents change meaning because they don't have the same meaning anymore. And the curator or the archivist is a very important part of this meaning making. First, in the decision to collect the object, but also in the way how the object is collected. So how it is contextualized, how it is put up in a record, how the collection is organized, right? And then it's not only the object. A lot of things that end up both in museums and in archives, they're not objects, but they're collections already by themselves. They're collections of papers or they're collections of objects, right? Like, for example, when I work in the context of university museums, there are a lot of collections, even scientific instruments, right? They're like, as laboratory equipment, they're bought in and they've been treated as collections before they ended up in the museum. Obviously, they had a different function for research or for teaching. There were research or teaching collections, not historical collections necessarily, but they had a meaning before as a collection, which is more than every single object, right? Like they get a meaning as a collection object.
Right.
And we have to be aware of that as well, beyond the object. I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Roland. You've covered so many interesting threads that we'll pick up later in the conversation. If I could bring Indira in now to talk about oral histories and to talk about her engagement with archival forms. Indira, can you? Sorry, Indira, can you unmute yourself? Sorry, we can't seem to hear you.
She is unmuted from our side. something wrong with her microphone.
Do you want her, Avehi, just to ask her if she should unmute on the computer? Maybe she's pressed the mute button on her computer.
Yeah, I think she's
on the
tried
laptop.
that. I think she's tried that, but somehow I think there's a problem with the mic. So I'm just going to move on. Hopefully we can get her in at some point a little later. But so just taking off from what Roland was saying about thinking about who creates or adds meaning to objects, what form they were in and who had them earlier, and what form they come in these different forms that they come in. What are some of the decisions that an archivist makes that influence or create an imprint on the form of the object then in the archive? If Jaya and Roland can take this, and Kamini, then in a museum context, would that role be the role of a curator rather than the archivist, leaving this imprint on the form of the object or transforming it? Roland, do you want to begin?
Okay, yes, obviously. I think in many ways it's not necessarily the same, but it's very similar, the role of the archivist or the role of the curator, right? The curator obviously has other roles also if we think about making exhibitions, which you usually don't have in an archive, or like now more and more archives also make exhibitions, right? And try to orient themselves towards the general public. But acquisition is one of the very traditional roles of a museum curator, right? But obviously it's different in the sense, I mean, it depends a bit on what kind of archive you are. If you're in the National Archives, for example, I mean, it's very different because already the set of institutions that will deliver their archives to you is already given, right? And you have a different kind of role, right? But I would say the roles between archivist and curator are elsewise rather similar when it comes to acquisition, or when it comes to also create metadata, for example, around records or around objects. Yeah, and also like the kind of like the cataloging. Obviously, the cataloging is also different. An archive catalog will look different from a museum a catalog or catalog of museum objects. But I think there is a lot of similarities there. There is something more you wanted to.
No, I think that we can begin with that. If we could get Jaya in to also talk about the role of the archivist, and in some sense, the role of the archivist as well as the institutional influence or institutional mission and policy that plays a role in how the object is described.
Maybe just one thing. I think it's very different. We also have very different kinds of archives, right? It's very different if you are like the National Archives, and there come kind of like a lot of legal issues with that, right?
Yes.
And we as IIT Madras, we are kind of a little bit in between. Obviously, we are trying to find out what the National Archives are doing because we're a central government institution, right? So we have to follow a lot of the rules and regulations, which is very different from, let's say you're running a community archive, right?
Right. Of course.
Which is, so there is a lot of differences in the kind of archives you're creating. Right. And the kind of responsibilities you have as an archivist in that case, and the kind of rules you have to follow or not have to follow.
Right. Jaya?
Yeah. As far as National Archives of India is concerned, I told you, these are government, I mean, as far as the public records are concerned, we have something called the record retention policy, or the record retention schedule for each and every government department. That is the basic guideline according to which the archivist of National Archives of India has to decide which records are of permanent value, and this takes place at the time of appraisal of records at the end of 25 years. Okay, now there of course the discretion or the understanding of the archivist is very important. He has to go through all the records. Individually, the subjects have to be checked. And sometimes we do feel that, the archivist, his knowledge of a subject or how he perceives a record would be of use in future. That makes a lot of difference. And I think that's very important for an archivist. He should be aware of what is taking place, because it's no longer just old records. We have to think of records how they are going to be used in future. And as we have seen, the trends of research, the users of archives, everything is changing. It's no longer just historians who will be coming here. So we have to remember that the record that we are appraising today, it may be of importance to the future, and that that assessment has to depend on the knowledge of the archivist. And we have seen that the archivist does influence his understanding of a subject. And of course, for private papers, as I said, since it's a government department, we have our very strict laid down procedures. We go by that. The committee decides. Of course, there are exceptions, like if there are private papers of national leaders, then of course we will grab it at any point of time we come across. Like any letter, any scribbling of Mahatma Gandhi, will take that. Of course, it has to be, the provenance has to be proved. And we have ways and means of doing that.
Okay, we can go into that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Indira, we can.
Oh, great.
Okay, finally. So we have Indira now. Indira, do you want to take us through, like we were saying, your engagement with archival forms, and what happens when they enter an archive, and the archivist's impression on the object or the form?
Well, I'm trained as a historian. I became an archivist later because I really felt it was important to start an archive that looks at contemporary India, not at the 19th century. And this was a very deep desire I had had after I finished my PhD. There were no funds for this kind of thing. So when I came to TIFR's, National Center for Biological Sciences for a sabbatical, I started with, not really with the other kinds of archival objects, but I started with oral history. And that meant really figuring out not only how you'd ask these questions, what you do, but also how you would store them. What form would they take when you stored them in the archives? What permissions do you need in order for them to become a resource for others? And only after that did I get invited to TIFR to begin their archives. And what was interesting in that setting up of that process was that, of course, we got a lot of administrative records. The Institute wanted this archive so we could set up our rules and we could say, okay, they're going to be accessible for the researcher. But here is the problem. What I found in the beginning is that it's better for an institution to have rules than not to have any, because when it doesn't have rules, it's easiest to say no. So in order to make things accessible, we created these rules. Right. But then when we went to, look at the collection and started, there was Vrinda Pathare, who's now at Godrej Archives, and once we got our initial collection, we started looking at all departments to see what kind of records could come into the archives, which would be central. And here is what happened. There were departments that held on to files that were almost 40 years, 50 years old, but they were so very proud of those files that they didn't want to give it up. So you really had one institution with multiple, archives that are created, locally. So since Homi Bhabha died in an air crash, his last, when he got the last leave encashment given to his mother, that was kept by administration. And that showed to you with great pride, but they would not hand it over. And I think one of the problems of the institutional archives is that you find that the archivists really are not empowered unless someone in the institution takes an interest to go and say, okay, these are the records that have to be acquired. So you have to bring them in. So I think that was something we struggled with for a long time in the archives. But the oral histories, I think, had the opposite problem, where people felt that if I've spoken to you, why do I need to sign this paper? I've spoken to you, you can put it in the archives, and that's that. And I'd say, no, you have to, give access to it, because other researchers will, refer to them later. And as a result, it took a very long time for scientists to sign this piece of paper. Whereas they were quite happy to have it quoted. They were happy to, for me to share that with others. But I said, look, when people come into this archive, it's good for them to have this.
Right.
And that's something I think, we still, the archive still struggles with.
So just to, you were talking about the empowerment of the archivist, and I think Kamini was going to kind of come in to talk about the role of the curator rather than the archivist. Where is that balance of power, and who leaves more of an impression on the object? Kamini, do you want to just address that before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I would like, instead of a competition between the archivist and the curator, I would really like to see this as a symbiotic relationship, because really that's what I think it is, because there's nobody who knows the object better than your archivist, because they have sat through the whole process of the object actually entering the museum, examining it, documenting it, entering every detail about it. They know that object, they know where every little scratch is. So for the curator, all that information is extremely important, but where I think the curator brings in the context, the curator is a storyteller, the curator sees how is your visitor going to interact with this object. As of now, it is an object with this whole fund of information around it. But what is the story? What is going to interest? How is it relevant today? For example, I remember this cooking pot that we had, that we used in one of the exhibitions, India and the World. It was just an ordinary looking terracotta pot. But when you looked at the story behind it, this was actually a pot that was found, it was over 1,000 years old, it was found in Iran. It had actually traveled, a trader had taken it. When he was going across the seas, he didn't know whether he'd come back or not, but he wanted the comfort of his own food and his own cooking pot that he would make it in. It was one of these pots for stew. So in those days, when they set sail and went off across the seas, they didn't know when they would come back, but they clung on to the little objects of daily life and the comfort that it brought them so many thousands of miles away. So that was a story of a cooking pot that was found in Iran and which had traveled probably from Gujarat so far away. So I think it's so important to pick up these stories, and for both the archivist and the curator to put them together.
Right. Yeah.
I also wanted to add to another point that Roland had made about, what are the objects? Be very careful with the objects that you allow into your collection, because we can see museums across the world, especially encyclopedia museums, with these thousands of objects that are never going to see the light of day, that are never going to be displayed, and you're spending these thousands of rupees or dollars or euros to preserve all these objects in that microclimate. So, and there are such stringent rules for deaccession, you're not going to be able to get rid of them either. So the collection, the archiving is so important.
Right, and just talking about, going ahead to talk about that note of accessibility and opening it out to the public, whether it's through exhibitions or just the archives as open spaces. Could each of you touch upon, within the archives that you've built, who has access to it? And also in conversation, over time, in conversation with the public, which is researchers, students, communities, have you had to change terms, vocabularies, or standards in order to create greater accessibility?
Are you talking to me,
go ahead, Kamini, and then maybe we can go to
Okay,
Indira.
I'm so glad you've talked about accessibility, because accessibility and inclusion are really two pillars of MAP. And we are talking about accessibility really from the most basic physical level of people, both people with physical and mental disability being able to approach us. And here I would like to talk even about our website, because a website is a way you access our archives. So we've really taken pains to see that our website is accessible to people of disability. For example, the color contrast we use, the fonts, the alt text that we also use so that, it's picked up by your screen radar. And the archive is divided into 6 categories, and it covers a whole range of objects, from pre-modern, modern and contemporary, folk and tribal, textile, craft and design, popular culture. There's just so much, so that people from different cultures with different interests all feel that there's some part of their life reflected in this space. So, but accessibility is really also about the stories that you tell and how you tell them. What is the language that you use? Are you looking at local language also in a very literal sense? What is the voice that you use? Is this only going to be the museum voice, which tells you the story, you hear only the curator's voice, the museum is the last word on it? Or are you going to bring in multiple perspectives? For example, for your labels, why not go into the community and see what an expert from the community says about your object? What does a child say about your object? I mean, what does an artist say about your object? So there are so many multiple ways in which you can create accessibility, which I think is really important, especially in the museums that you have today.
Okay, thank you. Indira, if I can get your point in.
Yeah. So I feel one of the things that, I began with is that, archivists are not, should not become like, custodians who just hold on to everything and then give you access. Rather, we can think of them who are trustees on behalf of the community that they're serving, so that they make it accessible to people, because I've seen too often this problem of access, and it would also happen in many of the institutions I got involved with. And one of the stories that come to mind right now is that I was always interested in seeing that private collections entered archives. Otherwise, if they remained with someone who was not a collector, it was never going to be used. So I had traced somebody who was known to Tagore's secretary, and I had found her in the archives, really. I was looking at Exeter, looking at some papers of Amherst, and there she was. So I said, oh, this is interesting, let me write to her. And when I wrote to her, it turned out that she was in New York, but she had letters from Abanindranath Tagore and various members who belonged to that Shantiniketan community, which were written to her mother, who was very, very close, her adoptive mother, who was very close to Tagore. And of course, I did what I thought was the right thing. I introduced them to Vishwabharati, to the archives, so that those papers could now, be accessed by others. And guess what? They have reached Shantiniketan, but nobody gets access to them because they are slightly of a sensitive nature, and everyone thinks they have to protect people who were not scared of anything when they were living. Now that they are dead, of course, you want to say, oh, don't talk about that. And I really don't know that I took the right decision at that point. Because I really feel terrible. And I have read those letters. I know what they had. I don't think, it would really enrich so much of our understanding of the institution. And so, there are numerous examples of this kind. But I gave this because I've been in touch with this person of late. So it struck me. She was also wondering, and what happened to the papers. So they're there with nobody getting access to them yet.
Roland?
Roland, before you come in.
Yes, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If
Yes.
Jaya can switch on her video. Jaya Ravindran.
Jaya,
Okay.
can you switch on your video? That's,
Yeah. Shall
yeah.
I?
Yes, Roland. Yes.
Yes. Okay. I mean, we basically have three different types of audience, I would say, both in the museum and in the archive. And one of them is academic researchers like myself or my students. The other one, which is probably the bigger group, is lay researchers, who are people who are not, but they're quite knowledgeable, right? Like they know how to use the archive. They're not professionals. They are, you can call them amateurs without being like, I mean, obviously they write a lot of like their city historians or whatever. They want to research about their family. Like in Norway, in the state archive, most of the people who used the state archive were actually people who wanted to find out about their family history, right? And they were quite knowledgeable how to do that, how to go through old church books and stuff. And the third one is the non-research public, right? Like which you want to engage. And traditionally the archives and the museums are on opposite ends of that, really, right? Like even though you had a lot of research museums specifically in the university, right? Like you had a lot of museums which were not open to the public, only open to researchers, but the general idea is about also in India, if you think about even the colonial museums, to educate the public, right? Who might not even want to be educated, right? Like you kind of drag them into the museum, and you have that even today. You drag in school classes into the museum. Whereas archives, I mean, India, we also have this problem that Indira just brought. A lot of the archives, right, they weren't even very accessible to researchers, right? Like, or there was a hierarchy, you would have to know somebody.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, what happens now in public archives is that there has to be some kind of opening to the public, to the more general public for them as well. And traditionally they're struggling with that, right? I mean, it's also not from the kind of ways how things are done. As I said, museums, you don't only have the collections, you also have the exhibitions, right? And in the exhibitions, you're doing basically that. The exhibitions are basically for a general public. Archives are only just starting to do that. And you can say in museums, it's the same thing. Obviously, you have an exhibition, and as we hear, a lot of objects never make it from the collection to the exhibition. I would also say, obviously, there's a lot of objects we will collect, not because they're great exhibition objects, but they're great, they have a lot of knowledge in them, right? And then again, the thing is, if you go to the storage, I mean, even though some museums have been kind of starting to do this, that they take their public also to the storage, right? And they want to show the stuff that is in the storage. And also, what we really have traditionally in museums, that you have a very authoritative narrative the curator tells in an exhibition, right? And I think we should be getting away from that as well. Yeah. That you can explore more in exhibitions as well, right? Like rather than, and having more a dialogue, I would also say, between the public and the curators, right? What I would say still about, I mean, for archives, it's very clear that they're open to academic researchers, and that academic researchers use them in their research. How accessible they are or not is a different story. But what we really have in museum collections is often the opposite, that historians are still, even though we had all this material turn and all that, historians still only go to archives, and they only read paper. They don't read what we call objects, right? And that's also because, like, traditionally, I mean, there are some other examples, like archaeology, for example, where you have more like of an object tradition. But generally, we also have this, that actually historians consult objects way too little to write their history as sources, right? Like if you talk about oral history, if you talk about the written record, what about objects? Like, and how do you integrate objects into your history writing? And let's face it, also museums haven't been always that good either to give to give access to these objects in order to write or to include. I mean, a lot of times I wouldn't come up with a competition. It's more like complementary, right? Like oral history gives you one aspect of something, the written record gives you some aspect of it, and the object obviously gives you another aspect, and they all come together to write history, right? So yes, on the one hand, the archives to give access to the general public, but also I don't have, like, if I think about the administrative archive of IIT Madras? How much can you make that accessible to the public? What is the point here? We have to discuss that, right? Like it's an open question to be, but also generally, how accessible are storage of museums to historians, and how much do historians actually use objects to write their histories?
Yeah. So just to go back to the to what historians consider true sources or the textual forms. If I could bring Jaya in to talk about accessibility, and I think we're kind of reaching a closing time, but I have one more question about absences. So I'll first bring Jaya in to talk about accessibility. Jaya?
Yeah.
Whether you've had to change terms, vocabularies based on feedback and discussion with the communities that you address or the researchers that you address.
Being a government archives, we have our own plus points, you can say. As I told you, it was started by the British in 1891. Of course, it was started as the first centralized archives for the British officials. It was supposed to be used exclusively by the British administrators. But post-independence, the scenario has been changing, and of course, slowly and steadily, it has been opening up. Now, in 1993, we came up with a legislation which is called the Public Records Act in 1993, and the rules were framed in 1997. That is the basic guidelines, based on which we function. And as per these guidelines, first and foremost, we don't get any restricted or closed records. Everything that comes to archives is open. Now the act, in 1993, it said that it is accessible to any bona fide researcher. That means they had to give some documents. And after 93, we came up with the RTI in 2005. RTI is one act, which is an umbrella act. It is above all other acts, and now everything has changed. This may be an answer to Mr. Roland also, because in RTI Act, any citizen of India can access any record created by a public authority. So under this act, whereas earlier under the Public Record Act, people had to give some letter of introduction from their university or institution. Now any Indian citizen who has a proof of his identity, we can give him access to the records here. That has really changed the way archives is being looked, the kind of people who are coming to see archives. But it is also creating some kind of problems for us, because these are people who don't have a research background. The people are coming to us just, looking for some material related to their family, or they don't know where to look for it. Or, they may just, we have even researchers, the terminologies, how it is changing. Like nowadays, there are a lot of researchers who are working on environmental studies, and they want to look at the British period records. But if you look at the term environment, you won't get it among the records. It would be listed under different keywords like rain, forest, drought, famine, because it's all linked to the environmental.
Right.
So, the archivist, the responsibility of the archivist, who is manning the research room, that's really very important. That's where, they have to interact with the researchers. Right. And that's how I have built up a lot of my, relationship with the researcher, because I used to really talk to these people, try to understand what exactly they're looking for. Yeah. Some of them may be just looking for their family background. Some of them may be looking for some research work on which nothing has been done till now. Like women's studies. Women's studies, like if they want to look at women prisoners, you may even come across, the lunatic asylums where women were put in under the Lunacy Act because they didn't want to put them in the normal jail. So it is all to be linked up. And I think Aparna will also know how much, the archivist really helps the researcher. You have to have that dialogue, constant dialogue with these people. It's an understanding for both of them. Right. Even we may be, trying to trace records. Of course, once we have that common kind of a platform, we can identify the records. Not a big deal.
Thank you so much. I think on that note, and the idea of, yes.
I just want to add one more. Yeah. Recently, not very recent, I should say, in 2005, on the occasion of the 125th Foundation Day of National Archives of India, we have launched an online search portal that's being accessed by people globally over 180 countries, researchers from over 180 countries are accessing it. It's a simple registration. Anybody can see whatever material. It's of course not the complete archives, but 50% of our references are there, and around 70,000 plus records, digitized records are there. It's a dynamic site. We'll keep on adding to it.
Okay.
That's for everyone to see.
Okay, thank you. I think on that note, I'll move to questions, because I see that we have quite a few questions, and some of them cover some of the other forms of archival material that I wanted to ask you about, as well as things like what are the gaps or the absences around objects, and how do we address those? But I'm going to pick up a few of the questions that we've asked. I think what I'll do is kind of okay. To begin with, Kamini, if I can bring you in, this is addressed to you. How are the categories of archiving decided? I'm guessing at a museum, one piece of object can be, of course, put in different categories, but how is it finally decided? Kamini?
That's something that we are actually going through now, because we are cataloging and updating all the collections at NAP. So you will find that objects, we have different categories, but they usually fall in one and the other. And so how do we decide that? So we create subcategories so that, people can, if it has to go, say, a painting, but it's also folk and tribal. So how do you draw the correlation? So then you create subcategories for them so that they can be, you can look for them in both areas. Okay.
The other question to all of you is, how are the panelists handling the collection of born digital material, and especially social media content, from tweets to TikTok, in their archives? Are you handling this material in your archives, and what do you think about born digital content?
But I think the pandemic, for one thing, has really opened up that whole question for us, because all the conversation has really shifted online. And all human interaction is really on the digital space. So it's now museums have started opening up their archives and collections to people. So now we all have access to veritable storehouses of treasures that you normally would not have access to. And museums have realized that this is the way to stay connected with their audiences. So it's not only researchers and scholars who have been able to use these facilities, but also people who are interested in art. And there were a whole series of digital initiatives that we introduced during this time. For example, our exhibitions we took online. And so we used various parts of the archive to cater to people of different interests. For example, we did an online exhibition on textiles, maybe on architecture through vintage photographs. But we are also creating new material for our archives. For example, we had this photo essay series called Homebound, which invited people to send in about 6 to 8 photographs with captions on how their life had changed during the lockdown.
Right.
That was sent in, and that makes actually wonderful new material on this whole crisis and how people have been dealing with it.
Right. I think Roland wants to add in. Roland?
Yeah, my hand on the has disappeared, so I'm raising not my virtual hand, but my real hand. I think there's two different kinds of digital objects we're talking about. One is where the original is actually not digital, but we are digitizing it and we are putting it out to the public. But obviously we still have to curate, and this is what people have to understand. We cannot just create digital copies and destroy the original.
Oh.
Because a lot of information would get lost.
Yes.
And we really have to care for the original. But the other one, and this is how I understand the question, is a lot of the material which we are getting now is digital in its origin. The original is not a physical object, but a virtual object. And how do we curate that? So the challenge is here, obviously, that there is a materiality to digital objects as well. So if I go back to my own institution, IIT Madras, we haven't looked for these, but you will find, obviously, we got the first. There was already computers in the 60s, but the first mainframe computer in the 70s. So what will you find? You will find punch cards, you will find magnetic tape. You will have a big problem. I can point back, I mean, in an earlier life, I was a physicist, right? And we had a problem already after some years to read out digital materials that was some years old back then, which was stored on magnetic tape, right? So we have to understand that there's a physicality. What a lot of archives did was, for example, burn their digital records on DVDs, right?
Yeah.
How long does a DVD last? That's the first question, right? Like today, my computer doesn't even have a DVD drive anymore. Second question, right? Like I don't even have, so the storage medium itself, but then even to read out the storage medium, right? Like we might not have the hardware anymore, and then the software, right? Like I've seen several cases where people created databases and then the software doesn't exist anymore. And even if you have the software, it doesn't run on a new computer. You may have all experienced that with a Word document, right? Like which you have created 15, 20 years ago. Word doesn't even allow you to open it anymore. Obviously, that's a nastiness of Microsoft, right? Like that can be solved. But we have that kind of problem, right? Like that with paper objects, we know paper objects, they usually last for 100 years, 150 years. We know how to treat them. We have long-term experience with these kind of things. With a lot of the digital born objects, we don't have that experience, right? Like, and we think digital is a great thing, but the digital world is moving so fast, right? That, and that's a big problem. And also to understand that also digital born objects have a materiality. And we have to be aware of that, and they have a virtuality, obviously. And the other problem is obviously the metadata, right? So if you think about, let's say email, or let's say WhatsApp or whatever, right? Like it's not enough to just dump the email somewhere, right? Like have a big hole and dump the emails in there, right? Like you have to have some metadata to that. You have to have a structure. And a lot of that is, I guess we all know, like we're clicking a lot of photos, right? Like we click photos like crazy today compared to what we did earlier. But if you don't have the metadata to these photos, right, you have a big problem. So these are two things that I would say. There's the issues that we are dealing with the digital born objects, not the things that we have digitized, but that come into our collection as digital objects.
Right. Thank you. I'm just going to take two more questions. Indira, if you can address this one. Are the folk narratives and folk songs, especially with regard to pastoral communities, being archived, given that these oral narratives might be the only entry points into those pasts, otherwise absent in traditional archival material?
This is an important question. And I think, you know, I myself do a lot of oral histories and recordings of the Patachitrakars. Interestingly, they have been painting about COVID-19, singing songs, and I've been trying to talk to them as to how, you know, they have been creating these songs and these scrolls. I think this is a very big question, though, because in India, you'll find that there are just so many of these local traditions, and we don't, unfortunately, have anything centralized, nor should we have something centralized. The one particular archive which has done a lot of work is Komal Kothari's archive in Rupayan Sanstha, which is in Udaipur, and they have a museum called Arna Jharna, but they have all of Komal Kothari's oral histories as well as recordings of songs from all over Rajasthan. He was one person who went to all the villages in Rajasthan. And by that, I mean really all the villages. So, you know, I find that quite an interesting place, and yet it's not been replicated in other parts of, you know, India. And that's why I feel oral history might be one of the ways that you might be able to bring into every archive that's storing other things, you know, stories of ordinary people, not just folk artists, but of ordinary people. And I think we need to understand what people experience, how did the experience change in their lives? And we haven't done that. Even Nehru Memorial, that does oral history, looked at, you know, freedom fighters. So it looked at, you know, what was the history of freedom fighters? You asked them, some years ago when I asked them, they said, now we are doing the minor freedom fighters. It's excellent they have that resource and they started it, but there has to be thought about, you know, how do we look at history today? You know, why is memory, you know, not given that space that ought to be given. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to just take one last question. Jaya, there are a couple of questions addressed to you in the National Archives, but I'm going to try and kind of club them together. So this is for Jaya.
Yeah.
So for the National Archive, when was the last 25 yearly review of materials done, and when is the next one scheduled? I think the next is, I think the shifts in the kind of public that consults a government archive with the coming of RTI is really significant. How is the National Archives adapting its protocols and practices to accommodate people with a non-research background?
First and foremost, this work of reviewing at the end of 25 years, it's a continuous process. I cannot say that 25 years old records of all the ministries will be reviewed today or this month. It is an ongoing process. What happens is the ministries are supposed to intimate us. Each and every ministry or department, they're supposed to have their own record room. And these record room, there's an in charge called Departmental Record Officer. He is the person who's in touch with National Archives of India. He intimates us about the number of files which are over 25 years old in his custody. So a team goes from here and they have that joint review. It can happen anytime, but we cannot barge into any ministry or any departmental record room like that. That is not how it is done. We have to be intimated that we have these many number of files of such and such ministry or department, and we'll go and review it. And it's an ongoing process. As on date, we have received files of up to 1986 or even 2000. But the thing is, records which are over 30 years old, only they are accessible. Even if we get records which are lesser than 25 years old, there is a chance that we might have got something like that, because we get records of what we know as defunct bodies, like commissions and committees which are constituted by some ministry. At the end of the term of the committee or the commission, the record becomes a defunct body. And those defunct bodies, as per the Public Record Act, they come to us, and the records will come to us, but we make them accessible only at the end of 30 years. And as far as the review is concerned, it's a continuous process. There's no time limit like 25 years old, and so everything of every department should be reviewed immediately. That's not how it is. And that's why I told you, like, it's not necessary that all the records would have come to us in one go. We may keep getting files of 1950s even now. That is how it happens, but we have to have intimation from the concerned ministry or the department. Without that, we can't review. And secondly, as far as the access policy is concerned, as I told you, we have this online search portal which is easily accessible. Under RTI, I'm getting RTIs around 30 to 35 RTIs every month, you can say. But if they give me any specific, because everything is about giving me a specific reference. If they ask me to do a search for them, it's not possible. It's not possible if somebody tells me, please give me the list of all the people who are given and the mercy petitions were accepted during the period 1990s. I won't be able to do that kind of research. But if they give me a specific file number, I'll identify if the file is with us. We'll tell them that, okay, the file is here, you make the payment, and we give it to them. Doing research is not our job, definitely not. But we invite them. If we get an RTI where we are not able to give an information, we tell them you are most welcome to visit National. Just carry your valid photo identity proof issued by Government of India, and we just allow them access in the research room. And of course, the research room in charge or the archivist sitting there, she or he has to have that dialogue with this person to make them understand how it is to be searched out, and help is always given. It's not that we don't do it.
Right. Indira, you had something to say, and then we're going to wrap up this session.
Yeah, I just had to, say this because, Jaya, if I heard you right, that you get a lot of inquiries from lay people, and it is impossible to do that, that research. But, I think one of the things that we have to do as archivists is maybe, through your organization, you create some kind of educational cell for ordinary people so that they can have access. They won't be able to tell you file numbers, for God's sake. No one will know file numbers. But can there be, can they be oriented to how are these records kept so that they can have access? Because that is the meaning of access. If we don't create, ordinary people who can access archives, what's the point in saying, we are giving access? No, we have to put in that effort to educate ordinary people as to what are archives, what are these complicated structures,
Can I come in?
Yes, sure. But
Yeah,
okay.
I heard you. The thing is, like we invite them to archives, and that's when, we have to tell them, we help them, we ask them, like most of the people who come to us nowadays are searching for their family records. And you won't believe it, many of them are related to property. So they would not know which is the record series where these records are like. And that's where the archivist sitting in the research room, they help them. They help them identify the record series, but through letters or through emails, it's not possible. And since we don't have a separate search wing, it's not possible for us to do online search for them and provide them with that kind of info. That's where I said, if they have to give the specific, many of them have the specific file numbers, so we provide it. Otherwise, we invite them over and they can even send representatives. Some of them are not able to come, so we give them that option also. But of course, we need a proper photo ID proof. That is required.
Sorry, I'm going to interject because I think we've really run over and I had so many more questions to ask as well. But thank you all so much. This has been a really interesting, fascinating conversation. We are going to continue. We're going to take we're not going to take a break. We're going to continue into a session on oral history, a far more informal conversation on exploring oral history, the form, how it sits in an archive, how do you access it, and the many sort of ethical issues, challenges, limitations. So if you'd like to stay on for that session, you can stay on. Thank you all so much for being here, and hopefully we can continue the conversations.
Could I request the panelists to keep their videos on if they're planning to stay on? Because we're on Facebook Live and then the page goes blank without your videos on.
Okay, so
Avehi?
Nandini also joined us?
Yes. Avehi?
Yes. Yes,
Can
Jaya.
I ask you, like this is exclusively on oral history?
This is exclusively on oral history, yes. We're just
because since
on oral history.
because
so like to,
since National Archives of India does not have an oral history division, I'd like to quit at the moment.
Of course, yes, please. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and
thank you
for answering our questions. So we'll just, please feel free to, we can wait for 2 minutes, I think, for those who are are there some in the waiting room waiting to join, or I think everybody's here. So this is more of a, I'm going to step down as role of moderator as such, but more, to be in conversation with Indira, Nandini, and with all of you, if you have any questions regarding oral history as a form, as a discipline. I think to begin with, Indira, can you kind of take us through an introduction to oral history as a form? And in the earlier session, we were talking about this reliance on the textual, which I know in our previous experience working together comes up a lot. So, talking about orality or oral form as a source, and as an archival form.
Thank you, Avehi, because as I said in the last session, I began my journey as an archivist more as an oral historian. And that meant learning quite a bit about what is involved in this form of archiving something, which really pays so much attention to memory. And we are often told how memory is unreliable, how memory, really, can you trust it? Is that a historical resource? But here's the thing that, historians are looking at questions of subjectivity, why people remember certain things, why do they forget certain things? And I think here I would say that, the process of archiving oral history, we can talk about it a little later, but the oral history form itself, which relies on this long interview which is recorded and which has certain protocols where you try to get permission from the person for recording, for using their interview to share with with a larger research community. These are all very, very important parts of that protocol. But end of it, you can do all these protocols, but you could still have, still not pay enough attention to protecting the person you have interviewed. Let me explain what I mean.
Yeah.
The kind of protocol we use often is in the form of a gift deed or a release form, which tells the person that, I have been interviewed by so-and-so for this project on this date. I understand that my interviews will be kept in an archive where it can be used for educational purposes. Okay? Now, this works if the person is educated and knows what he or she is giving you the right to. Quite often, when the person does not have that kind of education or understand those terms, I think it actually falls upon you as the oral historian to explain what exactly is going to happen with this recording. And, really, there's a long process of negotiation there. That the person might have told you things that are not meant for public consumption. And I myself have often highlighted those and said, do you really want this? And then sometimes, they'll say, come back and say, oh, I didn't realize it was being recorded. So you have to be quite careful because it is someone else's story. It is not your story. Right. You are the facilitator. So I think oral history, these are not really legal issues so much as deeper ethical issues. And I think you need to, as oral historian, go into the field to understand, oh, this person is saying a lot of things which he or she may not want to reveal in public. So maybe I should ask the person before I start, putting it in the archives and interpreting it. So that is what I would begin with. And of course, the whole process of, how we record and how we use the .wav format and not the .mp3 format, which, we'll often see that it may not stay over time. You have two copies, one that is for access, one that is for archiving. So those are, of course, and of course, you also generate the metadata. And of course, what else should I talk about? I think
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
The other problem is that I have often advised researchers who are doing their oral history work, and then I ask them, have you looked at your budget? And they're often, adding numbers of interviews without looking at the budget for traveling to those places, the budget for transcribing them. And, it becomes very messy. So many of these oral history recordings just stay in some kind of, space, digitized form, and then they're not accessed because you haven't really thought about how you're going to use them. So that is, again, another problem that I think we should come back to.
Right. Yeah. Nandini, if I can bring you in to talk about your journey as an oral historian of building a community archive. But then we can, address this point of access. And of course, I'll look for, questions that come up. But you can take us through a personal reflection on the form.
Yeah, personal reflection will be very nice because I started out with an activist, you know, and realized that a lot of history is very selective, it's very exclusive, and a lot of people in our country do not have very important things to say about a lot of issues, social, political, cultural, historical, but they will not find it recorded anywhere. One, because many languages do not have scripts. There are first generation literates. I work with people who did not read and write, but had extremely important things to say on environment, on rivers, on forest, on you know, what they thought was development, which was different from the dominant development paradigm. So when I worked for over 12 years, I thought this needs to be preserved because there's a large scale displacement happening of people, and when they are removed from the areas they've been always living, with them goes even their language and even their voices, you know, because they're dispersed, they're far from where they were, the memories get lost. So that's my journey, when I thought that at least before people disperse, the important records of their way of living, their culture, traditions, environment, their relations with the river, what they think is development needs to be voiced and recorded. So that's how I started. And as I said that there were two dialects, which Pawari and Bhilali, they don't have a written script. So people speak. And in fact, in the tribal and indigenous communities, there is a tradition of passing history only orally, you know, so from the time of their ancestors, even the stories of gods are not written or not in the form of any photographs that we have or statue. It's all narrated orally, you see.
Yeah.
So that's how oral history came to me as an activist, and I began recording it. So that's my journey, actually. And there are several challenges because I mean, this is, as Ronald, it really struck me when he said that historians have this thing of not only preserving but also destroying, you see. I mean, our role is so many times when you want a dominant paradigm to be reinforced, you also are in the business of destroying the alternate paradigms which people are pushing. So that history will get lost, proactively lost. So that's the struggle, you know, how to preserve that history, which is equally important, if not more.
Right. Can I just bring Heather in if she's here to talk about her journey as an oral historian? I don't know if Heather, are you around? And if you can give us your journey, and of course interviewing, doing multiple interviews with one person. I don't know if Heather's here. Okay, just to kind of reiterate, this is a session and a conversation on oral history. And so if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box or raise your hand, and then we can go to them. Indira, just so again, before we go into the archiving of oral history, just the role the oral historian plays. And I think, as you know, Potelli has said before about sort of oh, Heather's here.
Yes.
Indira, just so again, before we go into the archiving of oral history, just the role the oral historian plays. And I think, as you know, Potelli has said before about sort of oh, Heather's here.
Yes.
Indira, just so again, before we go into the archiving of oral history, just the role the oral historian.
It's okay. I've
feedback.
got it because I had Facebook on as well. Can you hear me now?
No wonder. Hi, Heather.
All right.
Yes, we can. I just wanted to bring you in to talk about your journey as an oral historian, and if you can take us through doing multiple oral history interviews with one person as well.
Sure. Look, I mean, I strongly appreciate hearing from Indira and Nandini, because their stories are really valuable for the work that I've done has been both in urban situations, rural situations in New South Wales, where there has been 200 years of colonial impact, but also in Central Australia with communities living what looks like a more traditional lifestyle, but who, all of whom are very strongly impacted by technology and are aware of things like recordings, oral history, and digital media. So there's a strong interest in Central Australia. I'm going to talk on Friday, I think, in a session there very briefly, but this is a good opportunity, I think, to agree with what Nandini has just said about the orality of the ways in which teaching and learning and performance occur in Central Australia. There has been a written version of the language for about 50 years, but most people speak and listen. There's a real oratorical style. And there is a very strong interest in using new media, using video and digital audio to conserve narratives about land, landscape, environment, and relationships and stories. But there's also very strong cultural conventions that in Pindajara society, you do not speak the name of the dead, you do not show images of the dead, and you don't discuss the personal possessions of people who've passed away. Now, that means that the old people who are knowledge holders had to make decisions about this. They're the ones who had to make decisions about whether they wanted their images to be seen. If they were going to speak in some sort of digital conserved way on a video or an audio, that would mean people would be listening and hearing and looking at them after they'd passed away. Now, that's a really big issue, and people had to think hard about that, make decisions about it. And I think the degree to which they did that, in a way, really echoes the ways in which people in this very urbanised setting in the middle of Sydney use Facebook, Indigenous people. And they do. There's mad Facebookers. Lots and lots of people I know are involved in Facebook and they network all the time. But researchers like me, non-Aboriginal researchers, have sometimes thought that was a way to do research or to communicate with people. It is a way to get in touch with people, but the way that Indigenous people use Facebook is very much under their control. People might use it to organise get-togethers or even funerals, but it is absolutely under their control. And so researchers are in no position to think they can appropriate that. This is something which is really, issues about power and control are really central to all of this, whether it's old people in Central Australia thinking about making decisions about whether they want their images to be shown after they've died, or whether it's people using Facebook to organise funerals in Sydney. Issues about power and control for researchers are really seriously important.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Thank you for that. I think we have a question from Shritama. Go ahead. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. So my question is for like anybody of you can answer this, which is to do about IRB and the process of collecting oral interviews, or really getting in touch with communities and working with them to produce knowledge. So when yes, so can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So when any kind of knowledge that is produced in synergy with the communities and it is published or circulated in some form, what are the sort of modalities or what are the sort of ethics that goes into how are the communities with whom you work are co-creators, or like what are the modalities of having their name on a publication or in an archival record when it is actually transcribed? And what are some of the considerations that an oral researcher need to keep in mind when the question of dissemination, circulation, and publication of this very oral records are involved? Second, and this is for people who are like still alive, for people, especially I have known collections when oral records exist and the people are no longer alive, then like what is the sort of ethics of putting them on a digital interface or on a digital database? So then is the consent of the family members of the person who are no longer alive taken? So what really goes into that? So that's something I'm really curious about.
Thank you. Indira, Heather, Nandini, if you want to address that. I think there was two parts to those questions.
I'll start, but I think I have to say here how much I admire Heather for the co-created books that she's done. She's shared authorship with the people she has interviewed. And I think I'll leave the first question to Heather. I'll say a little bit about the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, because we keep getting it now as we guide students through their PhD thesis at Srishti. Now, what I have seen in the US, I don't know what happens in Australia, Heather, that oral history, since it is voluntary, where the person says what they want to say and then they might give to you that interview, you're not required to go to the IRB. But in India, and especially because in Srishti we are with Manipal, which when it works with human subjects, it looks at the paradigm of the medical sciences. It wants an institutional review board, which has to be set up for, where the student has to present and say what he or she is doing. But that's because the nature of oral history is not understood by the institution. So I think if the institution understands what oral history is, then maybe, you don't need a special IRB, but your own, the committee that's looking at your research might be able to do that. And the other question where you asked about, do these rights that the person who has passed away, when they give you those rights and they have then passed away, can you put it onto a digital platform? Because, they have signed that paper. In my understanding, no. Because you have to take, unless you had already covered it in your original, sort of form, you have to go back for permission. Now, here is a peculiar thing, that in India at least, we use the Copyright Act, which relates to recordings, because we are recording an oral history interview. But usually those recordings are, in the Copyright Act, have to do with copyright of performances, of the performing arts, not of interviews as such. So there is a gray area there. And it is not known if those rights automatically pass on to the next generation. But what we do, in case you want to put it on a digital platform, you might want to go and ask the family if they would not mind, and you devise a form of some kind. But in my experience, using the language of intellectual property rights is absolutely, it doesn't work. Because, you cannot have intellectual property rights on somebody else's life story. So I find the Copyright Act a little better, and, you have to treat that material with a great deal of respect. Thank you.
Okay. I think, let's say, I think Padmini has a question. So let's listen into her question, and then maybe...
I think Heather needs to answer the joint authorship.
Yeah, I thought we'll take one more question and then club it. But but actually, okay, Heather, if you want to kind of.
Look, I would. There have been the people with whom I've worked very closely, and we've produced something in the end that was available for publication. We have certainly shared authorship, and in both the cases of the books, the person whose story was the focus of it was the first author. I was the second author. I was editing and working with them. But there are many other situations where I've been in a situation of working collectively with groups of other people, and I think that's more problematic. I see a role for myself as a researcher, as an analyst, which has got some constraints, some sense of integrity to it, but that doesn't mean that I have the intellectual property rights to the life stories of the people with whom I talk. And so I am constrained absolutely by an ethics, a university ethics process, and they require me to explain how I am ensuring that the property rights, copyright rights of the speaker and the interviewees are being recognised and supported, as well as the degree to which they're not being harmed in the process, and I'm not being harmed also as researcher. So there's a number of different dimensions to that. But as an oral historian, as you know, and as Nandini certainly is working in this area, as is Avehi, we work with it's a great honour to be able to share somebody's story, to listen to it and to think about it and to be involved in some way in making it more accessible. But we all do that with the knowledge and the consent, the informed consent of the people with whom we're working. And that does mean that we go back if we want to use them in a different way than they'd agreed to in the first place, by moving them from an archive or a printed version to an online version, then we have to go back and talk that through with people. But there's a role, for someone, for a researcher, I think, as an analyst, I think that is a different role from the role of a publisher, which is to really, make access available to somebody's story. So there's a couple of different roles there, but nevertheless, the life story is the person whose life it is, they're the ones who have the rights to that story.
Thank you, Heather. Padmini, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Is it okay if I'm only on audio?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so thank you very much. I mean, that was a really great session. So I have two questions that are kind of related to each other, mostly addressed to Heather, but I mean, anybody can respond, and also to Nandini. One is about how capacious can ontologies be when we are talking about different linguistic registers and different conceptual categories, right? So Nandini referred to the way in which communities that she spoke to had different ways of speaking about and articulating concerns about the environment, how facets and aspects of the environment. And then somebody earlier on, I think it was the person from MAP, was saying that, when in an accessible museum, we try to accommodate as many different ways of looking at an object or describing an object as possible. And so you have a number of narratives that are kind of palimpsestic, right? Or, a number of narratives that are different facets, so to speak, of around an object. So how do you then, especially when you're then writing a catalog or you're trying to create a metadata around these objects, how do you prioritize? How do you kind of just accommodate these different kinds of conceptual registers so that it does justice to all of these perspectives? And the second question, which is more relevant, more speaks more to what Heather was talking about, is the use of so I work in the digital humanities, so this idea of using, say, Facebook as a venue that people feel they are controlling is of great interest to me, because obviously the control is obviously in the hands of the platform, right? And so, when we're talking about, protocols that protect communities and cultural protocols, what happens to those cultural protocols when they are kind of coming up against, multinational corporations that are using your data? So yeah, thanks very much.
Nandini.
Yeah. Sorry, can you see me, hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yep.
So as I understood the question, how do you prioritize on how to bring out the material you have collected? Have I understood it right?
So it's more to do with, if you talk about certain concepts, so say the concept of privacy, for example, is a word that in English has a lot of shades of meaning, etc. Privacy and consent, actually. Neither of these words actually have suitable counterparts in Indian languages. So as Indira was very correctly saying that, when we talk about consent to somebody who doesn't speak English necessarily, for them, that mental model of what even consent is something very difficult to convey. So what I'm saying is that, in your work, when you've been speaking to people who do not speak English as a first language, the way that they're looking at the world is through their linguistic perspective, right? Okay. And so that adds different shades of meaning onto a concept that we know exists in English, but it might be, kind of much more nuanced or very different in the way that it's accessed through another language.
Yeah, in my case, I'll give you my personal experience in how we dealt with this. It was very easy because I was not an archivist or a historian, but an activist. And we collectively in the movement felt that all these stories need to be told, all this needs to be archived and stored before people who've been very thick in the Narmada Bachao Andolan. I was working in the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Before they pass away, I'm sorry to say, but we've lost fantastic leaders, local leaders. It was a collective decision that we did this recording, you see. And unfortunately, while all of us wanted that it is local, personally, I done it locally, but because I have the knowledge and technique to record it, I was the medium and we did it collectively. Even who to interview was collective decision. I mean, because we can't interview every single person. There's a deficit of resources. So it was easy. It was a collective decision. And because more than 80 leaders were chosen by a collective process, that this word was also spread around collectively, that what is it that we are doing? So it was easy. This is one way when you're working with a community, you see, when you want not an individual's oral history, but this is a community that was up against a development paradigm thrust upon them, and they wanted their stories to be told, and I was the medium, and more trust on me as an activist because I was the only one ready to do it at that point of time. So it was easy. So this is a very good way of moving about. If a community feels so, it makes your role very easy as an archivist. And then how to process it, how to circulate it, its dissemination, all becomes a collective process. And I would go by that, I feel. Have I answered your question?
Yes, thank you. That's very useful. Thank you.
You were also Padmini, you also asked about platforms, right? Like Facebook and that control over over people's archival content. Heather, we can't hear you.
Ah, I've done it. Okay. Just to answer the question about the initial part of that question, I think if I understood it, Padmini, I think the process of working with people and talking with people and trying to demonstrate what it is that will be the outcome is a start of the work that we do, and that's the work that I've done. But I'm not sure that that's adequate. So when I've written things, I've usually taken them back to the person, if they're still alive, who did the interview. I've shown them drafts and I've shown them the final copy. But writing is a particular form of, it's a particular structure of thought, which is different from orality in itself. And then the circulation of written works is different, and it's hard to follow if you don't live in a world of literacy like academics do, say. And digital, the escape of digital media is something we're all discussing, and certainly you're quite right in talking about ownership and control. But I think the process of keeping in touch with people over time is one of the only things that can be done to keep showing and offering people the outcomes, and to be flexible entirely about the process of retrieving material, taking it off the web, taking it out of publication, out of circulation, as far as that's possible. And that's certainly something that's happened. I think there's a difference in my experience between people who are being asked about their own experiences and the children and grandchildren of that person once they've passed away. And children and grandchildren, the relatives of deceased narrators, are often much less comfortable about having any material shown or visible or circulated, and much more concerned about any questions about that or revisions about it, because they're honouring the memory of the person who's passed away. So there's a few different things that are in consideration. And all of, historians who work with archives, like, it's really easy, people have passed away, you're dealing with archivists, with all due respect to the archivists in the room. It's a different, you've got rules, you've got an orderly process. That is not the case when you're dealing with real people, and certainly not with people who are working in very different cultural spheres. You just have to keep on in touch with people, I think, and be flexible about revision and removing from circulation. That's it. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Heather. We have a question from Bharat. Bharat, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah, hi. My question is a general question to the entire panel. And it's about what are the kinds of limits to oral narrativization as a form of record keeping that people working with oral histories may have encountered in their different contexts, and how are they navigated? For instance, I'm thinking of, say, how does one create records of practices which are embodied knowledges in a certain sense, which are tacit, and which may often elude narrativization as a form of documentation.
Indira, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Bharat, but that is a very difficult question, and I've often struggled with it myself, especially when I go back now to my example of the Patachitrakars I interviewed. Now, over time, they do narrativize something of what they do. But I think, and I resist using the video, because I got trained in doing audio, and I feel people are more comfortable with audio, but that's a debate for another time. But I find that they tell me quite a bit on audio. But when I try to, if I were to turn on the video to look at their process of actually doing the painting and singing the Patachitra, they're not entirely uncomfortable with that. But there'll have to be someone who takes you through the sequence of those processes. And somewhere you'd have to talk to them about what those sequences are. And sometimes they will not be willing to do that, because there might be rituals involved. There might be things of which I'm not a part of, right? So I think somewhere that would always remain a bit incomplete, no matter what you do. You might be doing a video recording of the process of the creation of something, and then also doing audio, but there will be one part. And this is like, it's not just those who belong to oral tradition. I'm talking about writers. You can have them talk about their process of writing. You can record, their writing. You have their end product as well. But actually, the way they put it together in their heads, the way they think about it, is not something they'll always talk about. So I don't know if that answers your question, Bharat.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Indira. We have another question. How does one negotiate individual research involving oral history and larger archival initiatives? As in, if I'm conducting interviews as part of my individual research, at what stage and in what form can it become part of an institutionalized archive? What are the parameters? Indira, do you want to address that? I mean, at what stage do oral history interviews or research become part of an institutional archive?
See, I think the problem, I mean, we face different problems in different countries. So I think, you know, if Heather will talk about what happens to the interview she does, in India, there has not been that kind of process where you are given specific guidelines by archives that collect oral histories, that if I'm doing an individual project, I can then donate this particular interview into the archives. Now, that is not very common. I mean, where I have done it, it's because I know a certain archive and I'm doing another interview and I can ask this archive, will you, house this? In the UK, for example, the British Library has specific format of, how you do an oral. Like if you are doing your family history and there's something interesting, they will tell you these are the 4 or 5 things you should keep in mind when recording, and then we will assess what you've done and we'll take it into the archives. But here, see, the National Archive shies away from keeping oral histories. But, they've been around long enough. They can say, yes, we'll open a division and keep it. I mean, surely they can do that. But, there is somewhere a rigidity in the thinking of, what can enter this hallowed space and what cannot enter. So I think that is one of the problems. So some of the interviews I've done individually as an individual, I'm now thinking that maybe, there is the Citizens Archive of India, there are other places, and I might want to talk to them to see if they'd want some of those interviews. And interestingly, the rights of one of them was given to me in the following way, where I said, do I have the right to use your interview? And Avehi, you know the person. This was P.V. Krishnamurthy. He said, oh yes, exploitation is the order of the day. Go ahead and use my interview. So I think, yeah, you have to find these other archives that might want to house you. And you might want to ask them if they have any criteria for that.
Right.
But maybe we should hear what Heather has.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. In terms in the university framework, and it's not a bad one. The ethics framework that we work within really just asks us to think through those questions and to ask the person we're interviewing or the group that we're interviewing about what they want. And the default is for those recordings and for the transcripts to be not accessible. And sociological research tends to make research about people's narratives and their names completely inaccessible. You use pseudonyms, you use numbers, you don't reveal anything about your sources. Oral historians have a different approach, and for many of the people I've worked with, there's been a real desire to say, this is my story, this is their story, they own it, and they are allowing me to listen to it and to work with it and to think about it, but not to take it or to claim it as my own. So that's an important part of the recognition of who owns the story. Archives in Australia, the holding bodies like the State Library of New South Wales that I often work with, has an Indigenous section and a general oral history section where they abide by the same types of ethical arrangements, and access is set by the joint decision of the of the interviewer and the interviewee, the narrator. But the final point I want to make is that there's a really important person you should contact, and that's Kirsten Thorpe, who's doing a PhD at a Victorian university, but who is an archivist at UTS, at my university. She's an Indigenous woman, and she is exploring a structure for archiving digitally oral history narratives, which was developed in the Northern Territory called Mugadu. And it was being developed a bit more in the United States with First Nations people and groups of a number of different communities. And she's exploring the way that can be set up in Australia in association with libraries and archives, where the individuals who made the recordings or their families have a flexible and ongoing access rights and control over access, so that rather than the whole archive being controlled with one access arrangement, you've got individual accessibility, and it's capable of being changed over time. And it's a really exciting project, and she's developing that at the moment. So she's the person to talk to.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. We have a question from Facebook on whether there are mobile apps available for archiving. I don't know if any of you can throw light on tools or mobile apps. Anyone? No. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, I mean, it's not of great use in India, but the short form oral history that Michael Frisch talks about, there is Pixtory that actually uses that, Pixstory. So it lets you take a picture and record the oral narrative about that picture or some story someone wants to say. But it is not the long form oral history. It is really for very short interviews, and Pixtory will archive it, and you can then curate it in a certain way. So that's the one app that I do know, but it works only on the Mac. It works on Apple, and it doesn't yet have an Android version.
Okay. Thank you. Sort of one of the questions and things I've been thinking about, which I want to put forward to the three of you, is also in the archives that you've encountered. How much is there of what the oral historian is thinking, or their kind of leaning and what they want to glean from this oral history interview? How much of background about the oral historian and their perspective is available along with the oral histories that they do? Have you encountered either notes from the oral historian in an oral history archive, or are we basing it only on then what we analyze from what are the questions they're asking and how they're leading from one question to the other?
Can I answer this question?
Sure.
When you are into it, then a lot of your ideas do come into it, I mean, the methodology, even the collectiveness or the individuality, why, what, all that is shared. And I think that's a very important process where the oral historian comes from. Why did the person do it? How? What was the methodology used? Clearly, being an activist of Narmada Bachao Andolan, if I say so, then it's a bias I'm putting up front, that I have not interviewed the pro-dam people, or that ideology, or that is not in my recording. So I have focused only on the other side, which I was part of. So I believe that, in fact, when in my whatever publishing has happened on one of the oral histories of two senior tribal leaders, the publisher, I wanted to keep myself very much aside, but the publisher wanted that who and why did the oral historian did this? What was the purpose of doing this? So it depends, you know. I think you cannot isolate the person. So no matter, I mean, you're just not anybody, right? You are also having a very, particularly when you are dealing with oral history, you are involved also with the people you talk to. It's not like going to a secondary source in a library where you just read 5 reference books. You have relations. So where do you come from becomes important in oral history, I feel.
Sure. I mean, you know, I addressed this to Nandini, Heather, and Indira, but of course, this is open. This is supposed to be a conversation. So please do, sorry, apologies that I can't seem to see everyone, and it's taking me time to navigate through the platform. So if anybody would like to speak, can you raise your hand or respond to the question? Where we're talking about the oral historian's involvement and whether there should be a record along with the oral histories in the archive of their thoughts and positionality when conducting oral history interviews. Yes, Indira.
You know, one of the collections that I learned from a lot was the Rojo collection, the Regional Oral History Office, which is in California. And I feel that the note that is right at the beginning actually contextualizes it. That how did that interview happen? Who was this person who was doing this interview? But quite briefly. And that's a format for some time I adopted myself. And of course, now that I write about interviews that I did in my blog, I find that, you know, that's what I'm trying to say in the blog are things that have never been put down anywhere. There is no space in the archive for saying, you know, what was the context. Though, you know, if some of my notes are interesting, they're interesting to me because I often jot down, you know, some background thing that's happening or something that the person says, sometimes maybe off the record, but I get the full context. And I find that there's no place as yet for that. Though I agree with Nandini that, of course, my ideology, my way of looking at things, my perspectives shapes the way in which the questions are asked. But I don't think in the archives as yet there's enough space for the oral historian and his or her point of view.
Okay. Heather, yes?
Yeah, could I just have a quick thing? I mean, I think it's incredibly important that the information about the oral historian and why it is we're doing this, what our interests are, is there somewhere if it's possible to be there. But the other thing I want to say is that as I've listened to the interviews that I've done over, you know, incredibly long life, I'm feeling very old now, and some of my early interviews are excruciatingly embarrassing because I ask a question and I cut somebody off because I haven't been listening to what they were saying. And I began to realize that my questions they revealed what I wanted to know, but they were often cutting across and distracting the person who was speaking. And increasingly over time, I asked less and less questions. And I would often now in the interviews I've done in the last few years, I tend to open it up and encourage people to talk, and then I just play and I might nod. And so I'm obviously giving non-verbal signals, but I'm trying not to ask questions. And I think in editing, one of the things I've found was interesting was to listen for the stories that people tell, that people within the interview, you will hear something which is quite a self-contained story that's got a beginning and an end. And that's an extremely interesting insight, I think, into the way that that person is structuring the narrative, the overall narrative that they're telling you. It might be something that they've just devised at the time. It might be something they've retold to their family or their friends or to complete strangers in the past. But looking for stories, I think, is an interesting thing to do, and not asking questions is a really other interesting thing to do. But I do think the reason that I go out and do this stuff is really important, and people should know that.
Thank you, Heather. Sort of to bring it back to oral history archives, and I know there are several different ways that people build archives and what they include. What in the archives that you've encountered and built, what all would you find in an oral history archive along with a recording? And if I can bring Venkat also in, sorry to put you on the spot, Venkat, but to talk about institutional archives, and when as a researcher or general public encounters an oral history archive, what all would you find within it along with the oral history record?
Not sure if you can hear me. My connection's a little bad. If you can you just tell me?
Yeah, we can.
So the archives at NCBS is very, very young. I mean, it's, well, I mean, as an idea, it's been around for 20 years. Open to the public over the last few years, and there are of course a few recordings that we've attempted.
Okay, sorry, Venkat, I'll have to cut you off because.
But what we're trying to connect with the oral history documents are also, and also link them to the objects that we collect as part of.
Venkat, I'm sorry, but we can't hear you very well. There's some distortion. So if you can type it in the chat box, I could read it out. Now we can see you though. So
no, let's not mess with this. I have a terrible connection, so I'll type it.
You could type it, and then we can.
Yeah.
I could read it out. I think this is an important kind of point that's also come up for people who are starting out oral history. Are there kind of training, Indira, if you want to talk about what you do at CPH, and of course, both Nandini and Indira, what we do at Avehi. Are there any training sessions that oral historians or people interested in oral history can attend? What are some of the guidelines, starting kind of points they should keep in mind?
Well, in the past, and you know this well, Avehi, because we were part of those trainings we used to conduct as part of the Center for Public History. We used to have a little certificate course, which was for 1 week, which was fairly intense and taught people the basics of oral history. We haven't done that for a while now, and I'm hoping that once we reopen, we might devise other ways of doing this, because we may not for a long time be able to do it face to face. So maybe, we could teach it over Zoom. But one of the things that we do have is the Oral History Association of India, of which Nandini is the president now. And I think we had talked briefly about doing these sessions as part of Avehi outreach activity to train more people. And these can be done, our members are all over India, so we could do it, in different parts.
And we have, of course, seen an interest, right, from history departments in colleges,
absolutely.
Universities, and interest in talking about oral history, learning about it, even introducing it to within the class. I mean, I know Indira and I worked on a project for school students where students use oral history to map community stories and neighborhoods around their school. And it was hugely successful. The children had a blast, and they learned so much about the history and stories of communities just outside their school who they may have not encountered otherwise.
Yes. That was fantastic. It was really a very, very fulfilling project, because, to have about 120 children who did 12 communities, and it was just, I was very moved by it.
Heather,
we trained their teachers who then worked with the children.
Yes. We did oral history sessions with the teachers, and then the teachers took it forward and introduced the children to oral history. Yes, Heather.
There's just to let you know, there's in a community that I'm involved in Sydney, in Bankstown, there's an organisation which works a lot with schools, and they've set it up as a thing called a communication unit. So it actually works with the school curriculum. and the kids were given instruction about how to interview, about how to edit the audio, about how to set up a website and how to put it onto the web. So it actually led them from the interviews through to developing a website, which you can look at. But these were kids in, you know, middle high school, and they were encouraged to interview somebody older than them whom they thought had demonstrated strength. And it's called Stories of Strength. And it's up on the web, and it's just fascinating because some kids interviewed grandparents, but other kids interviewed teachers or people down the road, and many of them interviewed somebody in a very different cultural group to them, very different religion, different language, come from a different place. So they are extremely insightful, or they offer lovely insights into this community, which is a very mixed community, but also it was great training for the kids. It was really interesting and exciting to see them do it. That's it.
So I think Bharat has a question. So Bharat, if you can go ahead.
This is more of a comment than a question, but I promise to keep it brief. Last year I was working in a project in Calcutta where I was basically creating, working with the private papers of several housing rights activists who were active in the city in the 80s, and trying to create a public archive out of that. And as part of that process, one thing that I did was to do several rounds of long interviews with those activists about their work. And I found that they were very important. Like the oral accounts offered a certain kind of mental map that was an important key in making sense of the papers and the collections themselves. And without those oral accounts, generating the metadata for those papers and creating categories and structures would have been very difficult.
Right.
So I just wanted to flag that there is immense value to oral history as an object in itself. But I think it's also a very important way in which it interacts with other kinds of archival objects and offers pathways for interpretation, which is significant. That's about it.
Oh, okay. Sorry, we thought we lost the last part of it.
Oh, no.
But no, agreed completely. I'm just going to address and take the next question, which was for Nandini, which is, I know activist archives are often concerned about government police surveillance and how archival material can be misused against activists. Has this been a concern for the archival projects you have been involved in? Nandini?
Absolutely. This is a very big concern because you have interviews, you know, which are very historically important, politically important. I'll give you an example. An activist has talked about how 30 years ago, when the movement just started, there were very draconian laws against activists, you know, and they were paraded handcuffed in the city to deter activists from taking part. Now that whole issue was taken up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that you cannot handcuff. There is a ruling, which is a very historical ruling, you know, that you cannot handcuff people who are posing no danger to society and cannot parade them. So that laid a foundation and really liberated a lot of activists. Now, when I have that interview, and I have a photograph also of that, those activists being paraded, but in the photograph, there is an activist who says, I don't want my photo right now to be shown. So we have these issues. Now, who were the activists? It's a historical case. It's a landmark judgment of the Supreme Court. You know, people should know how from being handcuffed and paraded, we have come to more liberal, and, you know, it was a struggle. So how do you navigate through all this? Similarly, people talk about movements that have gone to court, and if the ruling, they feel that the ruling was not right. So there is this contempt of court, and why, you know, how they feel the ruling is not right. Now, there is a possibility that the person may be charged with contempt of court, but the person has spoken with. So we all the time have to think very deeply about the safety, how will the police use it, whether the activist at the moment wants to be used or not. That's a collective also incidents. So the repercussions could be on the people who have not been interviewed. So yes, this happens all the time.
Thank you, Nandini. Could we talk a little bit about the challenges, limitations of transcripts and transcripts in the archive, the process of maybe editing and editing these transcripts and then translating that voice or taking that voice onto public platforms. I know, you know, in the past, those are sometimes what I struggle with, is that how do I best represent the person, the interviewee's voice, especially when I'm taking excerpts then onto public platforms for publications or films or any other media. So could we talk a bit about the process of editing and the transcript as a document? Indira, Heather, I mean, anybody could answer this or respond to it, but I'm just naming people I can see.
Yeah, as you know, again, Avehi, since we've worked together on a number of projects, whenever we took excerpts for publication, we have tried to go back to the person to ask, is this the correct representation? And it's not always been, I mean, they've not always agreed. You know, I still remember one of them not wanting to, you know, being very upset because I had chosen one part of his interview over another part of his interview. And this, I could not possibly publish a 6-page excerpt. So it required a very long negotiation to try and make that person understand what the limits of, you know, this publication was. So I think that is a challenge. And I think one of the things that I've often told people is that your entire interview is in the archives. In this platform, I mean, mainly I've worked with books that use excerpts. We have used this excerpt because, you know, we are trying to interpret what the institution was going through in the 1970s. So therefore, this really, your voice should be there talking about what you told us. But it hasn't always gone well, because I think sometimes people have just withdrawn or said, you know, we don't want our interview in the archive at all. So, you know, it's a bit of a tricky thing. But, you know, especially when you're creating an excerpt out of a very long interview, what you choose, what you edit out of that to showcase can sometimes be all right, sometimes there can be a problem. And that's something we have to deal with. We have to keep talking to the person and explain ourselves.
Heather, do you want to talk about the transcript as a document?
Look, transcripts, I find transcripts very helpful because I can skim through them and I can identify themes and topics. But there's no question that the oral, that the recording is really important in terms of inflections and hesitations. And so even the orality without an image is an important thing to conserve. And people who are very skillful at making filmic versions of interviews can make sense, can conserve the body language as well as people tell stories, particularly if there's a group of people. There's lots of things happening that don't make it onto the oral recording, but people who aren't very good at making videos or relaxing the person who's talking can end up with something that looks very wooden and very unnatural. And so I'm not sure that using video can be really intrusive. And I think it's problematic, even though it can also be really valuable in lots of ways. So all of those things are the sort of, I mean, that's one of the reasons Mike Frisch has been working on this idea of taking snippets, of trying to bring image together with orality. I think all of that's problematic, but again, they're very limited forms of creating accessibility. The ways in which people learn and teach are very varied, even within the very Western cultures that I've grown up in, and in the wonderfully diverse cultures that exist in India. You've got all sorts of different ways of teaching and learning and listening and hearing and repeating. And so I think the richness of all of that is really important to think about how that might be conserved, whether you have people talking about it or enacting it, thinking about performance, what performance occurs in communities, you know, as a traditional form, and that's a really exciting area to be thinking about fasts and those sorts of things which occur locally. We need not to be constrained. On the other hand, there are really good reasons for using transcript if you want quick, fast access to some of the topics that have been discussed.
There's a follow-up question to Nandini, which Nandini is saying, you know, she'd like this to be addressed to everybody. How do these concerns of surveillance and police court oversight factor in when you're planning how, where to store and make the oral history archive accessible? I'll repeat that. How do these concerns of surveillance and police court oversights factor in when you're planning how and where to store and make the oral history archive accessible? Nandini, do you want to lead the answer to that, and then?
Yes, it's been a big struggle where the person who has spoken doesn't mind saying so, but there are others who are involved mind saying so. So right now it's just parked, deliberating a lot on what and how to keep it. We have photographs, we have the recording with us, but how to keep it, where to keep it, how to, and if at all. So, but this is based on my experience. For more generalized thing, I would like Heather and Indira to throw light upon this, because it would be a learning of a more general kind in, you know, for all of us. So, yeah, I would like to know their views also.
Indira, do you want to say something on the ideas of the concerns of surveillance and police, court, legal procedures, and when you're planning how and where to store your archive as well as make it accessible?
You know, something that I think many of us have looked at is the Boston oral history that got subpoenaed, and then they said, no, you cannot take that to, you know, condemn a person in court. But I think that is a system where a judicial system that recognizes oral history, and oral history also has defined, you know, what its legalities are, what the rights are, what's confidentiality, etc. Those are respected. Now, I'm not so sure that that will be the case in India. So I think, you know, we haven't had that kind of a judgment that would really be a very progressive judgment, saying, you know, you have to respect the confidentiality that was promised. So I really feel that, you know, this is, I mean, since I've done mainly institutional archives, I have, you know, usually asked the institutions to keep the material, and sometimes they has been material, or people have said things, for example, things that happened in the 1970s during the Naxal movement. Some people who belonged to IIM Calcutta were involved, and they were telling me this, and that's been put into the archive. Now that's an acknowledged past, but I don't know if some things are ongoing. For example, what Nandini spoke about. I would not like the state to use it to condemn people. So I would have to be careful. I mean, so it brings into conflict this idea of accessibility and, you know, surveillance. Because if someone picks that up and uses it, that is not the purpose for which the Oral History Archive was set up at all. So, I mean, you know, we are talking at a time when you have activists who are still in prison with all kinds of, you know, things they're accused of. So I don't think, you know, this is a time when you can really trust and put everything out trustingly. That is something I'd worry about.
Yeah, I'll just move to the next question. I was wondering what the panelists thought about the interdisciplinary nature of research that may perhaps be carried out using oral history archives. Let's say from social psychologists who could look at questions of memory, identity, and intergenerational transmission, etc. Do they think that more researchers are going to turn to archival data for research given the pandemic? Are there other people also who'd like to kind of address this? I know there's someone from the IFA team here as well. And I know that there's been conversations around artists in the archive. Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm just opening it out. If there's anybody else who wants to talk about whether they see more researchers turning to archival data for research given the pandemic.
Can I just talk about the situation in, if you look at the, across the humanities, lots of disciplines use interviewing of one sort or another, but there are a lot of conventions within each one about how they're utilised. To pick up on the issues about security and surveillance, in my experience, the people who are, there's a range of ways that people deal with oral history, the people with whom I'm working, whom I'm interviewing. And as I said, there are some people who want to tell their story, who want to demand that their ownership is recognised, that this is their story, they're the author. And in fact, what they're seeking is a publisher, and that might well be a really important role that researchers can fulfill. I think it's not the only role that we've got, but it's one. But there are other people for whom this is a deeply problematic situation, and I'm working with a number of refugee communities at the moment, and for them, life in Australia, as you probably know, is really insecure, and they continue to be insecure and anxious about family in their countries of origin, as well as not being secure in Australia. And so for them, the idea of being identified or having their recordings and details which they choose not to reveal in any way public is a really big problem. And for those people, I've tried to talk at the beginning with them about only talking on the recording about information which they're happy to have made public in an anonymised form. But in general, I try to conserve that material as anonymously as possible, to take labels off, to take names off, to use numbers as identifications. And that's the procedure with social sciences and psychology interviews usually. So there's a range of different conventions in different disciplines, and there's also a range of different responses among interviewees.
Okay, thank you, Heather. This is a follow-up question to Indira. While the narrator-researcher negotiation you spoke about with response to interview publication can be an individualistic experience, in many cases it is a structural erasure. How do you as a researcher check your power relation with your narrator for a more accurate and ethical representation of their voice?
Oh, thank you for that. But that has to be, you know, there are some power equations that are inherent in this, especially when I'm talking to people who are non-literate, very poor. But, you know, there is also more than power, there's a very human relationship. that one has nurtured over the years. And I'll say this, that when the lockdown began, who were the first people who were calling me to ask how I was? It was the Patichitrakals. They were calling to ask, how are you? Hope your family is okay. It was not my educated friends. So it is really, in oral history, there is a relationship you build over time. And you obviously have to work hard to see that you do not, you use your interpretation in a way that you do not, talk down to them or interpret them in ways that, use your power. I mean, right now, I don't think of my relationship to them in terms of power, though I know I'm so privileged. But, they have been really people who've been nurtured. Even when my mother was ill, they came to sing for her on their own. So I really don't always see this. I feel you build a relationship with people over time. And when you are outside of that, before you build that relationship, all these things become worries. But over time, I know that they are free to ask me for any help they need, like their roof got blown up in the storm. And then, of course, thank God for internet banking that they have access to now, that one could really help them in some way. That is the least one could do, because you can't go and do something. But in the interpretation of their stories, I think, I see them as collaborators, and I see them as people who know much more than me about how they compose their songs. They're much more creative than I am.
Thank you, Indira. I think if we can, I don't know, if everybody can sort of contribute. I know there's some discussion happening on the chat about resources available in India that people can look at for oral history interviews, or to look at different sort of archives available online. So Aparna, Maya, do you want to take us through some of these resources that you are sharing and talking about within your own classes and other spaces?
Sure, Avehi. I've used the British Library Listening Project really successfully in my classroom. And they have, okay, there's a reason I don't open my video. So I've used the listening project quite extensively in my classroom. And I especially love using this one record. It's started from the 1970s onwards. And they were documenting lives of different sets of people, people on the street, calling them in. And these are linear interviews, but they really give you a good sense of the lived reality. So, this is not an oral project it's an oral project with a different. So he goes on to narrate his life, and I would always stop the video at about 20 minutes. I never heard it until a few years back, until 40 minutes. In the 40 minutes, he goes on to tell how he actually married another gay woman of brown Pakistani origin living in England to keep, to fool their parents about so that they don't have to declare their gay. So anyway, small things like that. I thought that was really valuable. Then another archive, which is not Indian, again, is the Cambridge University South Asian Studies Archive that I've used a lot. And that has amazing recordings of people who lived through British Empire. So women who came here as officers' wives. Now we have nothing on that. So in that way, it's a very unique archive, and I've used it. But yes, Maya directed our attention to an Indian archive, so I'll let her speak.
I think Maya's in a meeting.
I'll just be very quick. I figure also that we're not considering podcasts as also, sort of these stories of orality, and a lot of very interesting podcasts, have been coming out. I think to sort of have students also
create their own podcasts, and we've been doing this around sort of traumatic events. There's a student work that we did around 26/11, the Mumbai attack and such. So I don't know how quite to sort of put that in this same frame, but I would like us to also attend to those works, which are very recent but very interesting. And of course, the pedagogy panel will talk a lot more about our resources. Thanks.
Actually, there's many. Okay, we're going to say bye to Heather. She needs to leave. Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much. And I think there's several sessions now through the week that will address some of the issues that came up here. There's a session on archives and crises. There's a session on pedagogy. So please do attend those. Podcast is interesting. I mean, I think that looking at it in terms of archiving and orality, Indira, do you have a view on podcasts as oral history documents and archives?
Well, I think podcasts should be archived, but I don't think they're oral history, even though they're using oral. I mean, one of my favorite podcasts is the Museum of Lost Objects, which I'm sure Avehi you've looked at. Now, if you look at that does use oral histories, that uses interviews. So I feel that it would get away from the definition, too far away from it. But it is one mode that can be archived. It is oral. Not everything oral is oral history, but it is still an oral form that will tell us the history of our times. So I think podcasts should be, certainly they should be archived.
And I know you mentioned the Citizens Archive earlier, but are there other such sort of archives that someone who is collecting histories, who is doing oral history interviews, can they how do they kind of go about being part of one of these larger archives so that there's greater accessibility? Are there other archives that you can think of and share?
Well, I used to wish that Nehru Memorial encouraged people to deposit their stuff there, but that's not the case. But I know that what is still open is the Ashoka archives. Ashoka University has an archive, which I think over time it might become more open to people depositing their projects there. Because, that's what one interesting part of oral history is its archival content. That you're not looking at it as your project, which you then take and interpret. You also make it available to others to use and interpret, future researchers. So I think, that is what is important about oral history. There is some archival instinct within it. And I think we need to have more of archives of that kind,
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Does anybody have any other questions? I'm just trying to pull up. Shreya Malik, you have a question on songs of 1857, particularly in UP. Do you want to share what the question is?
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So I'm a PhD scholar and I'm working around the revolt of 1857. But this is particularly this is particularly in Uttar Pradesh. So the problem, so I'm currently in my first year. So the problem that I'm really facing of this research is that I'm unable to locate the proper archives which I should really look at, because if the data is not there, plus I'm looking at these lost women who actually participated as this a rebel army there in Uttar Pradesh. So I'm really interested in looking at that. I do have found some material memory, like I've been collecting it, going to these Gujar and Jat houses, but it's not that much. So if I was just looking for some recommendations from the panelists and the speakers, and anyone for that matter. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if you're aware of Amritlal Nagar's work. he did a lot of collecting of these songs. And I think they are archiving the material he had collected. It's in Lucknow. And his granddaughter, Diksha Nagar, has been looking at that archive. And I think some of these songs, I mean, there is a translation. I think it's called I'll just look it up now. And there is a translation of a little book he did. But he has more songs that he collected 100 years later. So you certainly should look up Amritlal Nagar's work.
I'll do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Indira. Do we have any more questions? I think we have Spandana here from the IFA archive. And, Spandana, if you can take us through some of the challenges, limitations of the, specifically with the oral history interviews, in the projects that you are managing.
Thank you, Avehi. I wasn't here when the question was asked. Sorry, we are all in office and I had to step out for a minute or so. Actually, we do have a couple of grants that work with oral history, but there are two things. First, we just have started dealing with these grants, so we are still figuring out how to deal with these things. The second thing is, for us, there is a question of copyright. So when these grants took place, let's say these were, I'm talking about 2008, 2007, 2006, the idea of the IFA archive wasn't in place. And when the grantees collected material, I don't think I think many of them did not have the idea of copyright and further sharing of the material and how to proceed with, the transfer of these items. So right now, first we have to figure out how to deal with that. I mean, we have to get in touch with these individual people who gave their, bites on the topic of these researchers. So it's a huge task, and we are still trying to figure out how to go ahead with this. One of the wonderful projects that we had, and thankfully this is available separately as, the traveling archives that Moshimi Bhumik did. And we had 3 grants with her, which sort of partially helped her creating this archive. And it's a wonderful thing. And there she has been dealing with a lot of oral history, song recordings, and the memories of people who have been singing these songs through generations. And I would request people to take a look at that archive and just enjoy that. And I am sure I will be needing help. We will be needing help to figure out the copyright issues, and I'm looking forward to the session that we are going to have tomorrow.
Yes. Shout out to the session tomorrow on copyright issues.
Tomorrow or day after tomorrow, I think, on Thursday. Is it?
Okay.
11th morning, I think. Sorry,
a blank. But just moving to the next question. Thank you, Spandana.
Yeah.
Moving to the next question on how do oral historians judge evidence from interviews given the fallibility of memory. I think that's really interesting, and kind of related to that is, something Portelli said about, I think, not looking at the specificities or the facts about events, but how people remember them and why they remember them differently. So I think that analyzing what the memories or how they remember that particular event, rather than whether it's correlating with documental evidence or factual evidence. Indira, do you want to respond to that? I think Nandini, do you want to say something?
Yes, it's very interesting question because any event, historical event, if you interview two people, they will have a different, their own perspective to it. And it's very interesting. Both will be true in some sense. And if you place them both, you can draw your own conclusions. That happens, for example, we have several strategies in the Narmada Bachao Andolan, like Jal Samarpan. Now, what happened at that particular time? I mean, when waters rose, police was coming from here. There was a threat. I mean, there was a group of people who had decided we will drown, and there were some 500 people watching it, and there was tension, and there were arrests, and there was rain, and so these kinds of strategy, when you ask them that how does it pan out, what impact it had on the individual, on the movement, it's bound to happen that two people will narrate it differently. So one should not be, that's the beauty of, I would say, the diversity, it's a beauty into this whole thing, that you'll get so many nuances, diversity and I think it's a strength rather than weakness, that you cannot have one incident that is happening in this way will be narrated exactly in the same way by 10 people watching it. It's not going to be like that. And that's the beauty of it. And you can share it that way, that the same incident, see. So, yeah.
Right. And within that, what is then the collective memory of the community memory and the individual memory? And if you present those, sometimes they have different responses to each other, right?
Yes, some may think that summer was a did have a negative impact on the movement. Some would say that was the reason why the dance stopped. I mean, how do you analyze a strategy? No two individuals will say that this is exactly how the impact was. I mean, I will say it differently, somebody will say it differently. And you have to learn from that, both perspectives.
So how would you then present that within the archive? Would you?
I place both
alongside
even more. In fact, I always like to do that. Look at the diverse voices. Like there is another strategy, "Dubenge par hatenge nahi," letting all our houses drown. Now, the people who those who have witnessed what happened to the people in the initial villages may decide, no, this strategy is, we don't want to implement it. So putting both the perspectives before, and it's a learning, like why did the villages in the initial stages took that strategy up, why the villages that were to submerge later on decided we don't want to do it, what went into that whole thing, so it's you place it both before the people and you draw learnings from them. Both the perspectives, or multiple, I would not say both, there'll be multiple, so try and bring out as many as you can. That is the beauty of it, that's the richness of it.
Indira, do you want to jump in? Also, does it kind of speak to how we look at the term evidence?
Okay, so I think, I want to, before I address the question of evidence, I think we should also look at how we interpret memory. If we look at someone's memory as if, these are the facts, then it doesn't work, because it is somebody's memory. And there are many reasons why the person is remembering or misremembering, or even telling you something that is a figment of his or her imagination. And as we know, Potelli, who brought in subjectivity in research very well in The Death of Luigi Trastulli and Other Stories, tells us why that entire town misremembered the date of Luigi Trastulli's death. He died in 49 and everyone kept saying he died in 52. And I think he sees that as the part of, collective memory trying to establish a more heroic end for Luigi Trastulli, because when he died in 49, they did not do the things they said they would do. But all this takes him a long, he has to take a very long view of things, and he has to begin with the archives and then look at people's memory, look at the song that was composed and begin to see what is it that happened? Because in 52, there was a general strike and they really felt that they had got something. And they wanted to insert something that happened earlier into that. Now, none of them are saying this is why we did it. That is for the researcher to interpret why is a group doing something in this way. And I think he and Luisa Pasolini, these are the names I take who look at subjectivity in research. And I think, there is this older question of unreliability of memory is really turned on its head by them, who begin to say, of course, there's subjectivity. Let's not shy away from it. Let us look at what is it that people are saying, why are they saying this? And then, comes the question that are documents then more reliable than people's memory? And you'll find the document too is written by somebody. Avehi, as you remember, our Czech friends always talk about how so many of the minutes that are there in their archives during the Soviet regime are just, they're about meetings that never happened because, they've been cooked up. So obviously there is also, it introduces the notion of what you trust and what you don't trust. And I don't think you can say we trust documents more than what people say.
Thank you, Indira. Thank you for that. I just, I think we have about 5 minutes left to this discussion. So if I can just plug Ojai, of which a lot of us are members and part of the committee, and Nandini is the president. Indira was one of the founding members. So Nandini, do you want to kind of just take us through some of the things and projects that we've been talking about especially during this lockdown, and kind of the way forward of things, ideas we've been thinking about, so that we can open it up here. And if there are people who are interested in working with us in various ways, that's one. And the other is, please do look up the Oral History Association of India. We are a young but really diverse body of researchers, oral historians, people from various disciplines who have come together. And we do have an annual conference every year. So I'll just hand over to Nandini to kind of talk about what are some of the ideas we've been thinking about.
Yes, it's an organization that is really trying very hard to take up ahead the tradition of oral history, which is there in our country, needs to be promoted. So all of us, it's a membership-based organization. We have a website. We have, as Avehi said, an annual conference. There's a lot of learning to take place. We need participation. We need to improve our website, have a lot of volunteering help is required to carry this organization forward. In fact, we've been trying to have a program because increasingly we are going digital as we are not able to meet personally. And there's a wonderful idea which we had floated, and we would like to pursue it, regarding the COVID situation that we are facing and the memories and stories that could be told. I would hand over to Indira because she had also taken initiative in this matter, and how do we proceed?
Well, I think that's a discussion that's still ongoing, and we'll have a plugin of stories that belong to this period, which is such a unique period in our history. And we will soon be setting up the criteria for which people can use to submit these stories. And when we have our new website, which will be maybe anytime after July, we will work towards plugging in these stories into that platform. I myself will be interviewing the Patachitrakars as well as other Chitrakars who are now drawing the gods and goddesses wearing masks and, talking about COVID. So I think, these ideas are interesting, and, I have some idea why they're doing this and why they see this as an important thing to sing about, to paint about. So I'll be doing interviews with them. But, people are doing a range of interviews, I think.
Thank you, Indira. I think also as oral historians based in several different cities and as members of OHI, we've been thinking about, and we have done in the past, is conduct oral history workshops at universities, at schools, at other sort of centers. So if you are looking for someone to kind of do an introduction to oral history and take you to a training, that's also something members of OHI will do. I know we didn't talk too much. I mean, there's been a lot of resources available and being, kind of typed out thanks to the amazing team that's finding all the links and collating all the resources. One, a digital archive that I'd like to talk about and is called the Bracero City Archive. And so Bracero History Archive, I'm sorry, which kind of documents the stories and narratives of Mexican workers who were brought to the US in 1942 to about the 60s and were part of this larger contract labor program. And the website is really interesting and not just the fact that the oral histories are available online for you to navigate, but they also provide tools and ways in which family members of some of the workers, some of the farmers who are part of the program can interview them without, sometimes waiting for an oral historian from the program or somebody from outside to come in and interview. So I thought that's a really interesting website that both has the collection up, but also provides resources that you can use. It's called the Braceros History Archive. But I think we've reached time. So unless anybody has any other last questions, thank you so much for staying through an entire session. Nandini has something to say.
Actually, many of the people who are part of this session belong to Oral History Association of India, and we all do it pretty voluntarily, but I would appeal on behalf of Oral History Association of India, if you could become members, help us promote this organization, see that more people interested get into the organization. Support all kinds, of course, financial is one, but in upgrading our website, the various way, but membership based organization it is, and we would love it if there are people interested in oral history to become members also of the association. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. I think just a second, I'm trying to share the PDF to the schedule for the rest of the week. I'm sorry, I'm technologically.
Yeah, no problem, Avehi. I think the schedule is up, but tomorrow specifically, there's the journey of an archive. So
Yes, please join. Please look at the schedule. It's up. Registration is of course free, and there are many sessions through the week. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Indira, Nandini, everybody who asked questions as well as responded to the questions. I hope we can continue these conversations. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Avehi, for conducting this.
Thank you.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Could we stay back for a follow-up? Venkat, Maya, Hari.
Sure.
Yeah.
Avehi, Deepika.
So I'll stop the recording.
Yes.